You are about to learn one of the biggest secrets in the history of the world. It's a secret that has huge effects for everyone who lives on this planet.
From December 7th, 1941 until August 14th, 1945, the United States was engaged in the largest, most deadly war in the world's history. This is a brief timeline of the war against the United States and its allies in the Pacific. In 1930, the Japanese Empire consists of the Japanese home islands, the Korean Peninsula, and the island of Formosa, now Taiwan. There is increasing military and domestic pressure for the empire to expand. In 1931, Japan invades and occupies Manchuria. In 1937, Japan invades China to start the Sino-Japanese War, a war that will last until 1945. One of the more horrifying events of this war is the 1938 massacre of Nanking, where more than 100,000 Chinese civilians are slaughtered in an attempt to terrify the country into submission. By the end of 1939, Japan has conquered large areas of northern China and most major East Coast cities. In September of that same year, Hitler invades Poland. It is the start of World War II. All through 1940, as war rages through Europe, Japan continues its expansion on the Asian mainland. By September, Japanese forces have entered Indochina, now mainland Southeast Asia. In response, the U.S. bans all iron exports to Japan and initiates a military draft. In August 1941, with no let-up in Japanese aggression, the U.S. imposes an embargo on all raw materials to Japan. With limited access to these needed raw materials, Japan plans an expansion into the Western Pacific, where European-owned island nations have an abundance of oil and other natural resources. In preparations for this, a Japanese carrier fleet leaves the Kuril Islands in November, heading for Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, Japan activates its plan for control of the Western Pacific Basin. On December 7th, aircraft from the Japanese carrier force attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, inflicting heavy damage to the ships stationed there. This same day, Japanese troops land in Thailand and Malay. 3 days later, they sink the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse off the coast of Malay. They then invade the Philippines and capture the island of Guam. Before December has ended, the Japanese have landed in North Borneo, forced Hong Kong to surrender, and captured Wake Island. The Burma Road, the main Allied supply link to China, is now controlled by the Japanese. In response, a massive airlift over the Himalayan mountains, nicknamed the Hump by pilots, is begun and will continue for the next 3 years. The Japanese continue their conquest of the Philippines with the capture of Manila. They attack and occupy Rabaul in the Solomon Islands. It is here that Japan establishes a major base of operations in the southwestern Pacific. In February, the U.S. suffers heavy losses to the Japanese Navy in the Battle of the Java Sea, one of the earliest sea battles of the war. Also in February, the British surrender at Singapore. In March, the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, surrenders to the Japanese. And in Burma, the capital city of Rangoon, now Yangon, is invaded by Japan. In April, after a 3-month siege of the Bataan Peninsula, U.S. and Filipino forces surrender, and thousands die on the infamous Bataan Death March. Japan now extends its eastern expansion to Dutch New Guinea. Although the U.S. has been on the defensive during the 4 months since Pearl Harbor, Jimmy Doolittle leads a U.S. squadron of B-25 bombers on a raid of Japan's Tokyo. This daring mission provides a tremendous boost to U.S. morale back home. In May, the U.S. fortress of Corregidor falls, and all U.S. forces in the Philippines surrender. Also in May, U.S. and Japanese naval forces engage in the first Battle of the Aircraft Carriers in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Although essentially fought to a draw, it prevents the capture of Port Moresby in New Guinea, that in turn would provide a base for a Japanese invasion of the Australian mainland. In June, to divert attention from their planned attack of Midway, the Japanese capture Attu and Kiska, U.S. possessions in the Aleutian Islands. The main Japanese objective at the Battle of Midway is to inflict heavy damage on U.S. Navy aircraft carriers. However, they are decisively defeated with the loss of 4 of their own carriers. Although the Japanese Empire has reached its maximum expansion, the Battle of Midway represents a turning point in the Pacific War. To prevent U.S. offensive action, the Japanese invade Guadalcanal in August, where for 7 months U.S. and Japanese troops fiercely battle each other. Casualties are high for the U.S., but much higher for the Japanese, who are unwilling to surrender and fight to their deaths. In 1943, the U.S. goes on the offensive in the Pacific. In March, in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, superior Allied aircraft caused heavy losses for the Japanese Navy, with minimal Allied losses. In May, the U.S. regains Attu and Kiska. June sees the U.S. begin its drive westward to recapture the Japanese-occupied Pacific Islands, with landings on New Georgia in the Solomon Islands. In November, U.S. Marines land on Tarawa and Macon in the Gilbert Islands. The 4 days of fighting for Tarawa are especially bloody. In that same month, U.S. troops land on Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands. 2 months later, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan suffers heavy losses as they launch hundreds of aircraft from 9 carriers in their attempt to destroy U.S. naval forces supporting troop landings on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. The 2-day battle results in Japanese losses of 3 carriers, 600 aircraft, and hundreds of skilled pilots. This is followed by U.S. landings on Guam, Tinian, and West New Guinea. In September, U.S. troops land in Morotai of the Dutch East Indies and Peleliu of the Palau Islands. In October, General Douglas MacArthur fulfills his 2-year-old vow to the Philippine citizens of "I shall return," with the landing of troops on Leyte. The ensuing Battle of Leyte Gulf is the last major sea battle of the war. With close to 300 warships in active combat, it is the largest naval sea battle in history. It results in heavy Japanese losses, including 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and 10,000 killed. At this time, in an act of desperation, the kamikaze suicide planes begin their attacks. The Japanese, in an all-out effort to prevent an attack on their homeland, are defending each of the islands to the last man. In February 1945, U.S. Marines land on Iwo Jima, just 600 miles from the Japanese home islands. They secure the island but suffer heavy losses. By the end of April, Manila and Corregidor are secured, and U.S. forces land on Okinawa. Just 340 miles from Japan, it is the planned launch point for the invasion of the home islands. After 82 days of bitter fighting, the island is secured. In May, the war in Europe has ended, and all efforts are now directed at the Pacific conflict. In Burma, Rangoon is recaptured. Australian troops land in Borneo in June. B-29 bomber raids continue their attacks on the Japanese home islands. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima with devastating results. 2 days later, Russia, who signed a peace treaty with Japan in 1941, declares war on Japan. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. That same day, Russia invades Manchuria. On August 14th, Japan surrenders, and on September 2nd, formal surrender ceremonies are conducted on board the battleship Missouri. With over 60 million military and civilian deaths and untold casualties, the final chapter of World War II comes to an end.